Hello friends of the World's Whale Project. It's been a while, I know. I would like to invite you today, as closing 2019, for a conversation regarding Christmas, Christ, God, and the real nature of this celebration, which is among, more than 1,200 million people around the world celebrate these festivities. And I totally agree that it's time for us to stop this descent of between science and God that is being spread all around academic circles and intellectual circles, and not only that, in all around the schools and all. Because it's Christmas and I'm a Christian, I feel the duty to share with you the reconciliation between God and science. Let's see what we have to say. I'm going to show you scientific points of view and intellectual points of view. This is the last edition of 2019 for the World's Whale Project, and I hope you share the opinions, support the channel now that I have Patreon, so that you can support the channel in the idea that we can build a better world using technologies that we have for more than 100 years. It's not necessarily the ones that we are being told in the mainstream media. Yes, wind and solar, no doubt. But there's many others that can be explained, for example, by the book Fire from Ice by Eugene Maloff. And we need to think about this. So reconciliation, and let's say that God is in our side. So I have to tell you guys, Merry Christmas! And I hope that you take this program with the seriousness that it has within, and is to celebrate Christmas, Christ, God. Welcome.
What is really real? Is the ground really here? We say that objects like the ground are composed of molecules, and those molecules are composed of atoms. Here's a simple illustration of the atom. You can see that in the center is the nucleus, and that has protons and neutrons. And around the nucleus are electrons. But you might also notice there's some void space or empty space in this atom. Can you estimate the percentage of void space in an atom? It's 99.9% void space. And actually, there's 13 nines after that decimal point. So the ground seems solid, seems like it's here, but it's nearly 100% nothing. Same goes for the stage, the seats, this whole auditorium. And I know that in pop culture, they like to tell you that you're significant and you're a somebody, but in modern science, you're pretty much nothing. Tell that to your psychiatrist. Everybody has their own view of reality, whether a scientist, a philosopher, or a theologian. You see, philosophers and theologians, they debate abstract ideas, kind of like myself, and we wonder, what practical impact are they having on our day-to-day lives? And then we see scientists, like myself, and we're seemingly dispassionate people, and we sit in our labs and we do experiments. And we wonder, what contribution are we having to the deeper meaning of life? You see, I'm someone who holds graduate degrees in both science and theology. And I seek the nexus of both science and God, so that I'm neither dispassionate nor impractical. Famous scientist Sir Isaac Newton seemed to be able to put together these ideas. And he said the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. But sadly, we have drifted from this point of view. You see, simply what I believe is that science and God, as I have understood them, go together. They're integrated. And even more so, with the advent of modern science in the last 100 years or so, it's actually helped us make some connections of those seemingly mystical qualities about God. I'd like to give you 3 examples to illustrate this. First one is probability. Probability in modern science is this interesting thing. You see, pretty much everything has a probability, whether it's the normal or the really unusual. Let me give you an example of one of those unusual things. You see, if we take the atom again, the atom, there's actually a probability that a particle in the atom can leave the atom and at the same time violate the law of conservation of energy. Now, the law of conservation of energy says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. Yet a particle in the atom, without having the energy to do so and no available energy, can overcome an energy barrier and just leave. That's the weirdness of probability. Now, why is this interesting theologically? Well, theologically, we wondered, well, how can God act in these seemingly miraculous ways? I mean, isn't it just magic and myth? For example, and there's plenty of them, God is described as omniscient, all-knowing outside of time, described as omnipresent, that is, everywhere present. And we wonder, how is this possible? But yet, what if there was a finite probability that God could act miraculously? And that's not impossible. And what if there's a possibility that God doesn't overstep the bounds of science, but actually works within the bounds of nature and science? You see, what I'm saying is this. If modern science tells us there's a probability for unusual activity happening, and we're okay with that, then we should not be as surprised that God could act and do miraculous things, and there's still a probability for that. Now, I'd like to hone in on 2 of these things that I just mentioned, that of omniscience and omnipresence, and use this in our second 2 examples. So, next, the theory of relativity and our thought discussion of how that connects to omniscience. That is, God is outside of time and knowing all. Well, the theory of relativity came about in the 1900s by Einstein, and it's this theory that has been proven and described over and over throughout the decades. It has many facets, and the one we'll focus on is that between velocity and time. Simply said, the faster an object goes, the more lag in time you'll have. There's an interesting set of experiments that were done to illustrate this in 1971. They are the Hopfler-Keating experiments. They took a couple cesium beam atomic clocks. These are really accurate clocks. And they synchronized them. And they placed one on the ground and one in a commercial airliner that flew around and then later landed on the ground. Well, what did they find? The clocks were no longer synchronized. They were actually off by an order of nanoseconds, and that could be calculated from the theory of relativity. Which one was behind in time? The one that traveled faster on the airliner and later returned to Earth. Well, this idea can be expanded such that the faster you go, the slower time goes, until you reach your apex at the universal speed limit. That's the speed of light. And you know, at the speed of light travels so fast that time actually no longer progresses. You see, time is not a factor for light. Or we might say light is outside of time. Well, that's weird, I know, but that's the theory of relativity. Why is this interesting theologically? Well, theologically, we know that God describes himself and is described as light. And yet we wonder, how could God be omniscient, that is, outside of time and knowing all? You see, if consider God, we know he sees past, present, and future all at the same time and knows all. And that seems eerily similar and parallel to the idea that a photon can be outside of time. Now get me straight, I'm not saying that God is a photon. What I am saying is that in modern science, if it tells us that light can be outside of time, we should not be as surprised that God could be outside of time. Weird, I know, but let's keep going. Let's evaluate the third topic in modern science that I want to look at, and that's entanglement, and how that relates to the idea of omnipresence. Well, entanglement is this really interesting, strange idea that came about in 1935 by Einstein, Schrödinger, Rosen, and others. And let's say you have two particles, and they could really be photons, electrons, some molecules, various things. And if they're entangled or connected, a change in one will affect a change in another. Well, you think no big deal, but the interesting thing is you can separate them more and more and more, and they can still be entangled. You see, distance doesn't seem to be a relevant factor. This reached the furthest limit I've seen in 2012, published in a journal of Nature, where these two entities were separated by 143 kilometers. That's 88 miles, and they were still connected and interacting with each other. That was the case of photon teleportation from one place to another, and that happened instantaneously. This was fictionalized in the TV and film series Star Trek, if you've heard of it. In Star Trek, they beam people up, and they're moving somebody from one place to another pretty much instantaneously, and the distance doesn't really matter. That's the idea of entanglement. Well, why is this interesting theologically? Theologically, we wondered, how could God be omnipresent? I mean, isn't that kind of weird? Well, if God is here and he's interacting with people, and those people could be separated a distance from him all around the world, somehow he's doing that instantaneously all the time. This also seems weirdly similar to the idea of entanglement. Get me right. Again, I'm not saying that God's an entangled particle. What I'm saying is that if in modern science, particles can interact with each other even while separated at a distance, we shouldn't be surprised that God can interact with humans, again, separated with a distance, and doing that instantaneously. Well, you might ask, so what? So what? Well, again, I believe that science and God, as I've understood them, are totally interconnected and integrated. And I know you're going to say, wait a minute, proofs by analogy are not proofs. And I know that. What I'm saying is, these seemingly mystical qualities about God that we thought were magic actually have an interesting precedent in modern science. You've seen this Erlenmeyer flask of boiling water on stage here for the last 10 minutes or so. And so I ask you, why is the water boiling? Okay, no doubt, you're going to say that the heat from the hot plate is being transferred into the liquid water. As the temperature increases, the kinetic energy increases, exciting the liquids in the liquid molecules in that liquid state to go out to the vapor state. The vapor pressure increases until it reaches atmospheric pressure, at which point nucleation points within the glass allow bubbles to form, overcoming the enthalpy of vaporization, and thus it boils. Duh. But actually, what I tell you is no, that's not really why the water's boiling. The water's boiling because I want some tea. Love tea. Tea's really good. Which answer is the correct one? You see, we actually need both the science explanation and the deeper meaning explanation to get the fuller picture of reality. Each answer is incomplete without the other, and really insufficient without the other. And it causes us to have a smaller understanding of what the reality is. Einstein put it this way: science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Now, I understand that Einstein didn't accept any conventional religion, for sure, but he was moved by some, quote, cosmic religious feeling. Many of you probably here today are academians or students, and you probably are focused on your academics, fields of study, and things like that, possibly without much regard to the deeper meanings of life. And what I'm saying is, maybe we're missing out on something. Maybe we need to work towards a reality that's a little bit bigger than that. So I ask you, what is really real?
As you have seen in the last minutes, I'm going to introduce you now with an academic point of view. You just saw the scientific point of view. And now I'm going to see an academic one of my favorites, Mr. John Lennox. He has been one of my favorite academic apologists in apologetics, which is the virtue to defend Christianity, God, in front of the supposedly opponent, which is science. As you saw in the first documentary by TEDx, there's no difference between God and science. It's just that there's some interests that want us to believe that we have to make a choice between God and between science, when there are, as proven by the last exponent and the last intellectual scientist and theologian, that is not true. But let's take a look of one of my favorite academics that I have followed for many years now. I'm talking about 12, 15 years, John Lennox. Welcome. Let's hear his proposal.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I believe in God. I believe in the supernatural God who created the heavens and the earth. I believe in a God who holds the heavens and the earth in existence. I believe that on the basis of rational evidence, similar to the beliefs held by the founders of this house, who gave this university the motto, Dominus Illuminatio Mea. They saw no contradiction between faith in God and the utmost excellence in rational inquiry. And if I dare mention my alma mater of Cambridge in this holy place, I would remind you that on the door of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge are written the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." And as we look at the rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries, Alfred North Whitehead and many others commented that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. What I am amazed at is that serious thinkers today continue to ask us to choose between God and science. That's like asking people to choose between Henry Ford and engineering as an explanation of the motor car. When Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, "I've got a law, I don't need God." No, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the greatest work in the whole history of science, because he saw that God is not the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. God doesn't compete. Agency does not compete with mechanism and law. Why is there something rather than nothing? Alan Sandage, the brilliant cosmologist who became a Christian in his 50s, said God is the answer to that question. But people are now so desperate to show that the universe created itself from nothing, which seems to me to be an immediate oxymoron. If I say X created Y, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. If I say X created X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which simply shows that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists utter it. It reminds me a little bit of G.K. Chesterton, who said, "It is absurd to complain that it is unthinkable for an unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything." The heavens declare the glory of God, says the ancient psalm. And we've unraveled a bit of that, seeing the fine-tuning of the fundamental forces of nature. It's something that's so striking to scientists that it demands explanation. And it seems to me that Arno Penzias hit it right. He is the Nobel Prize winner who discovered the microwave background on which a lot of the evidence for the Big Bang is based. He said astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. But I want to come to what I think is one of the fundamental arguments for theism. I take it this house believes in reason. That's why we're all here. And as a scientist, I believe that the universe is rationally intelligible. That is something that has struck some of the geniuses of science as demanding an explanation. Einstein said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And Wigner talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematician thinking in her head in here can come up with equations that seem to fit the universe out there? Well, how is it indeed? Because the irony of the atheist position here is evident. My atheist friends, and I have many of them, tell me that the driving force of evolution, which eventually produced our human cognitive faculties, reason included, was not primarily concerned with truth at all, but with survival. And we all know, ladies and gentlemen, what has often happened and still happens to truth when individuals or commercial enterprises or nations feel themselves threatened and struggle for survival. A leading philosopher, Alvin Plantinga of Notre Dame, says if atheists are right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then they have given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including their atheism. Their biology and their belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Yet my atheist friends still insist that it is rational for them to believe that the evolution of human reason was not directed for the purpose of discovering truth. And yet it is irrational for me to believe that human reason was designed and created by God to enable us to understand and believe the truth. Curious logic. By contrast with that, biblical theism asserts that ultimate reality is personal and intelligent, and the reason science works, and this was the motivating force that drove the great pioneers of science, is that the universe out there and the human mind in here that does the science are ultimately the product of the same intelligent divine mind. Human beings are made, we are told, in God's image, and that means that science can be done. That makes infinitely more sense to me as a scientist than atheism does. Now let me come briefly to ethics. Ethical behavior, like rational behavior, of course, does not itself require religious belief. This is consistent with the fact that humans are created in God's image as rational moral persons. But just as I suggest that rationality cannot be explained without the existence of God, so I dare to suggest that the existence of morality cannot be explained either. As modern science sprang from Judeo-Christian sources, so did the concept of human equality. Listen to atheist Jürgen Habermas, arguably one of Germany's leading intellectuals. He said that universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life in solidarity, the individual morality of conscience, human rights and democracy, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there's no alternative to it. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. And it seems to me he's hitting the core of something important, because the value of a human being on which such egalitarianism rests is based not on what the human being can do, but what she's made of, or how she's made in God's image. I never forget speaking on one of my many visits to Russia to a colleague in the Academy of Sciences. And he said, "You know, John, we thought We could abolish God and retain a value for human beings. We found we couldn't, and we murdered millions of them. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn has said, if I'm asked, why is it that 60 million of my fellow countrymen were sacrificed? He said the answer is, we have forgotten God. Science, of course, marvelous as it is limited. Even a Nobel Prize winner, by analyzing a cake, cannot tell why it was made. But Aunt Matilda, who made it, can tell you. She can reveal it to you. But if she doesn't reveal it to you, you'll never know. And that brings me to my next evidence. It's the same with the universe. We can analyze it magnificently, but ultimately, if it has a maker, and I believe it has, only he can tell us what it's all about. And he's done so in the powerful narrative of the Bible, in particular in its analysis of the problem with humanity, not simply in terms of behavioral breakdown between people, but a vertical breakdown of trust between us and the Creator. The unique solution to that problem is not simply in terms of human ethical development, although that's very important, but in terms of something far deeper altogether. The restoration of the fractured relationship with God through the salvation he has brought through Jesus Christ. A radical relationship that empowers us to live ethically from God. And here we reach what for me is the chief evidence, not only for the existence but the nature of God. It is Jesus Christ. He it was who not only taught the golden rule but embodied it, fed the hungry, healed the sick and suffering, and welcomed society's outcasts, brought honor and respect to the marginalized and ashamed. And he's brought forgiveness and peace to multi-millions around the world. He's able to do this, of course, because though he was a man, he uniquely never was only a man, but God become human. The central evidence for this startling claim is, of course, his historical resurrection from the dead that launched Christianity in the world. This is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, a crunch issue. If Jesus rose from the dead, death is not the end and atheism is false. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is false. And I remember at Cambridge as a student listening to the brilliant Sir Norman Anderson, a legal expert, going through forensically the evidence from his legal perspective as a brilliant lawyer. And he said at the end of it, the empty tomb then of Jesus forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain. Just finally now, as I read the Bible, I do not only find intellectual satisfaction, but I find a great deal of that. I sense the voice of God speaking to me. You say that's intensely personal. But ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked tonight about belief in God. And I want to strongly emphasize that God is not a theory, he's a person. And if the origination of me qua person is a personal God, then the most exciting thing really is there a possibility of getting to know God? And so I don't simply believe there is a God. I've come to know him and trust him. And I have strong reasons for doing so, because of Christ dying and rising again for me. And that has generated in me a sense of utterly unmerited forgiveness, acceptance, and peace. That has enabled me to face the ugly side of my own nature, and with God's help to do something about it. But it's enabled me to face something else. The hardest problem I face as a Christian is the problem of evil and pain. My niece getting a tumor at 22 that kills her. What do I say to my sister? And this is the hardest problem we face. But it seems to me that atheism here has no answer, because by definition, atheism believes that human death is the end, so there is no ultimate hope. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, we could stay here till midnight and beyond arguing, as has been done in this university for centuries, what a good God should, might, would, could, if not, possibly might, just could he not have done, and we'll get nowhere. So it seems to me there's another question we can ask, and it's this. Granted that life presents us with a double picture. We see some beautiful things. We see some ragged edges. We see hurt and pain, and we see joy. How can we come to terms with that? And it seems to me here is no simplistic answer, but a window into an answer, and it's this. If it is actually true that Jesus is, as I believe him to be, the Son of God, then we can ask the question, what is God doing on a cross? And the answer comes back at the very least. God has not remained distant from our human suffering, but has become part of it. And the other side of that is this. Because Jesus rose from the dead, he is going to be the ultimate judge. Now here's an irony, because atheism has no ultimate hope of justice by definition. The vast majority of people in the history of the world have died without justice and will die without justice. And if death is the end, then of course they have no hope of ultimate justice. But the promise in the New Testament, guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus, is that he is to be the judge in the coming day. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the reasons why I believe that God is real and worthy to be trusted. Thank you.
Okay, guys, now that God and science is reconciled, and there's very mathematicians, because John Lennox is a mathematician and philosopher from Oxford. You can follow his academic postures and apologetics. We can say that God and science don't have to fight each other, but they're come together, and we can make peace among each other. We can hug and love each other. I wish you the best Christmas ever. I hope you have had a good time with family and friends and have related this season with God himself. And I wish you the best of the New Year's. Ho, ho, ho. Au revoir. Bye-bye. Hope to see you next time in the next edition of the World's Well Project as part of React Today. Au revoir. Bye-bye.